The wagon came before the town was fully awake. Willa call. Drace heard it from inside the house, the low creak of iron-rimmed wheels on frozen gravel, the muffled percussion of a draft horse working against a heavy load. She had learned in 18 months of Oregon winters to identify sounds the way a sailor reads water. The creak of the barn door meant the wind had shifted northwest. The particular silence after a hard frost meant the well pump needed priming. The sound of that wagon every Wednesday morning rolling down the narrow track behind her property meant the world had decided once again to leave something at her door that nobody else wanted. She pulled on her barn boots without sitting down the way she'd learned to do it quickly and wrapped both hands around her coffee mug before stepping onto the back porch. The driver, a broad man named Ket, who never offered his surname and never looked directly at anyone, was already working the tie ropes on the flatbed. 3 slabs this morning. White oak from the look of them, the bark still attached along one edge in ragged silver-gray strips. Each one was massive, the kind of cut that came from trees that had taken 70 or 80 years to reach that diameter. Trees that had stood through droughts and ice storms and the particular cruelty of Oregon summers before a Cascade timber saw had brought them down in a morning. The mill had rejected them for reasons Willa now understood. The edges were irregular, curving away from true and slow arcs that made standard dimensioning impossible. The grain ran straight for a foot and then tilted following some internal logic the tree had developed long before anyone thought to harvest it. Ket released the last rope and the 3 slabs came off the bed with a sound that carried across the backfield and probably woke the Vane household 30 yards to the east. She didn't look toward the Vane property. She already knew Hector Vane was watching. He was always watching on Wednesday mornings, standing in the narrow gap between his storefront and the woodshed, arms crossed, wearing the particular expression of a man who has decided someone else's business is his to evaluate. The wagon rolled back up the track without ceremony. Ket had never once stayed longer than 4 minutes, and Willa had never asked him to. She stood on the porch until the sound of the wheels dissolved into the general noise of Harlan Crossing, coming awake somewhere a forge, starting up a screen door somewhere on the main road, the distant complaint of cattle being moved toward the lower pasture of the marsh spread north of town. Then she looked at the slabs. They were not beautiful in any way she had a language for yet. They were large, rough, bark-edged, and streaked with dark mineral lines that ran diagonal to the grain like old scars. They smelled of sap and wet earth. They did not look like furniture. They looked like something the forest had discarded. She drank her coffee and looked at them anyway. 6 months earlier, she had stood in the Harlan Crossing County Courthouse and listened to a clerk with spectacles read numbers from a ledger in a voice that carried all the warmth of a land survey. The debt Thomas had left $340 in unpaid materials. Contracts, 2 notes co-signed with suppliers in Eugene. 1 outstanding balance with the county assessor had been compiled into a single figure that the court would require her to address within 24 months. If the debt remained at the end of that period, the 40 acres would be put to public auction. Willa had nodded once, signed the acknowledgement form, and walked out into the September air of 1881 without speaking to anyone. She had known the number was coming. Thomas had been meticulous about his engineering work and careless about everything else, including money, and in the 18 months between his death in the rock slide at the Packer Creek Quarry and the court's final accounting, she had watched the figure assemble itself from a dozen directions. She was not surprised. Surprise she had found was a luxury that required enough margin to be caught off guard. The Drace property, Thomas's family land inherited from a father who had homesteaded it in the 1860s, was 40 acres of rocky high ground above the town's south tree line, with a view of the Douglas fir canopy that was genuinely beautiful in autumn and genuinely irrelevant by February. The soil was thin over basalt and unsuited to serious cultivation. Thomas's father had used the land for a small cattle operation that Thomas had let quietly collapse after his father died. And in the years of their marriage, Willa had used the back field for a kitchen garden that produced herbs hard squash, and the particular satisfaction of having made something from ground that didn't want to cooperate. No one in Thomas's family had wanted the property. His brother in Portland had been explicit about it. His cousin in Medford had declined in a letter so short it was nearly insulting. Willa had kept the land because she had nowhere else to go. That made more sense because returning to her family in Lexington with nothing after 9 years of marriage felt like a particular kind of defeat she was not willing to carry. And because there was something in her, some old, stubborn, possibly irrational piece of her inheritance from her mother's side, that did not respond well to being told a thing had no value. She spent the winter of 1881 learning what the property actually required. She split her own firewood, which she had never done, and discovered that her shoulder protested for a week before it stopped protesting. She patched the roof on the south-facing barn corner where the shingles had begun to separate, standing on a ladder in 30-degree air, with a bucket of cut nails and a hammer, learning by the second row that you drove the nail at a slight downward angle to keep it from working loose in a freeze-thaw cycle. She kept the accounts in a small cloth-bound ledger with a pencil because the ink in her pen froze on the coldest nights, and she tracked every expenditure with a precision that came from years of managing the books for the restaurant Thomas's family had run in Cincinnati during the first 4 years of their marriage. She was not helpless. She had never been helpless. What she lacked was a direction. Amos Gettrick came to her door on a Tuesday morning in March of 1882, 2 weeks before the Wednesday deliveries began. He was 52, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had been outdoors in Oregon weather long enough to look like the bark of a white oak, not unkind, just permanent. He was the operations manager at Cascade Timber Company, 3 miles east of town on the Callaway Road, and he introduced himself plainly and without preamble, which Willa appreciated. Cascade Timber processed timber for flooring cabinetry and structural beams. The mill ran 6 days a week and produced, along with its usable product, a continuous stream of material that the commercial buyers would not accept: live-edge slabs with curves that made standard dimensioning impossible, oversized pieces too wide for the gang saws, boards with mineral streaks or wormholes, or the kind of dramatic grain figure that flooring customers consistently rejected because it read as inconsistent. For 3 years, the mill had been hauling this material to a disposal site south of town at $4 a load. 2 weeks earlier, the Harlan Crossing County Board had cited Cascade Timber for improper waste disposal near Calder Creek and issued a fine of $50 with a notice that continued violations would increase the penalty. Amos needed a disposal point. He needed it within reasonable distance of the mill on private property, with an owner willing to accept a regular delivery. He had identified 3 potential properties in the area. Willa's back acreage was the most convenient by road distance. He offered $5 a month in removal of any accumulated material she didn't want after 6 months. Willa listened to the full explanation without interrupting. Then what is the wood worth? Amos considered the question with the mild interest of a man who has thought about it before. To us, nothing. We pay to dispose of it. You pay $4 a load to the disposal yard. We did, yes. So you're saving $4 a load in disposal costs plus the fine exposure in exchange for $5 a month to me. Amos looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. That's roughly the accounting, yes. Willa's mind was already moving through the arithmetic the way it always did. The years of ledger work had made her reflexively precise about numbers, and she could see the shape of the exchange clearly. Amos was not doing her a favor. He was solving a logistics problem. That was fine. She was also solving a problem. I'll take the arrangement, Willa said, at $5 a month. I keep any wood I want after 60 days, not 6 months, and I want it in writing. Amos agreed with the slight nod of a man who has found a straightforward solution to a straightforward problem. He did not ask what she intended to do with the wood. She did not tell him because she had not yet fully decided. What she was thinking about as she watched him walk back down her front path toward his horse was a workshop in Kentucky, in an old man's hands, moving across a piece of ruined wood as though it had told him something no one else could hear. Hector Vane owned the general store on Harlan Crossing's main commercial block, which meant he occupied the particular social position of a man who knew everyone's business because everyone had to pass through his store eventually. He was 61, broad-bellied, with the kind of relentless surface affability that functioned as camouflage for a nature that was fundamentally protective of its own position. What Willa did not know in the spring of 1882, what she would not know for more than a year, was that Hector Vane had borrowed $85 from Thomas Drace in the spring of 1879 against a promissory note with language that Thomas's attorney had drafted and that Vane had signed without reading carefully. The note contained a standard clause common in Oregon debt instruments of the period that subordinated the debt to the estate upon the debtor's death in cases where the estate could be dissolved without liquid assets. Thomas had died before Vane repaid $1. Under the specific provisions of Oregon inheritance law in 1881, if Willa's estate was liquidated through court order to satisfy the primary creditors, the material suppliers, the county assessor, Vane's note fell into a secondary category that would effectively be discharged without payment. Hector Vane did not need Willa Drace to fail out of any sentiment. He needed it as a financial outcome. This was the thing about Harlan Crossing, or about any small town in the American West. In the early 1880s, the social architecture looked simple from the outside. Neighbor alongside neighbor on flat ground. Everyone visible to everyone else, but the actual structure underneath was a set of overlapping obligations and interests that had nothing to do with neighborliness. Willa had managed the books of Thomas's family restaurant in Cincinnati long enough to understand that what people said about money and what they meant about money were rarely the same sentence. She noticed Vane watching the Wednesday deliveries from the gap between his store and woodshed with the regularity of a man who has a reason beyond curiosity. She filed it. She did not act on it yet. Pearl Osgood brought food. This was not unusual in Harlan Crossing. When something difficult happened and a household food appeared at the door, which was one of the genuine and uncomplicated kindnesses of small-town life in 1882. What was unusual about Pearl was that she had been bringing food to Willa since Thomas died in the autumn of 1880, and she had not stopped. Not because she and Willa had been close before, they had not been particularly, but because Pearl Osgood at 71 had buried a husband herself and understood that the loneliness of that specific situation did not end when the casseroles from the other neighbors stopped coming. She was a small woman, sharp-eyed, with white hair she wore in a practical bun, and hands that were permanently bent at the knuckles from decades of work. Her husband Walter had been the best furniture maker in Harlan Crossing from roughly 1855 until his death in 1870, and in the 12 years since his death, Pearl had kept the workshop behind her house locked with a key she wore on a cord around her neck. She came to Willa's back door on an afternoon in late April with a pot of venison stew and stayed for 2 cups of tea, and at the end of the second cup, she set her mug down with a deliberateness that signaled something had been decided. "Come with me," Pearl said. They walked across the property line through Pearl's kitchen garden to the back of her house, where a workshop built of rough-cut fir boards leaned slightly westward in the manner of structures that have been settling for a very long time. Pearl unlocked the door with the key from the cord around her neck. The smell came out first, 12 years of closed air, but underneath it still present the particular combination of linseed oil and sawdust, and something dry and clean that Willa recognized before she could name it. The same smell as her grandfather's workshop in Lexington, which she had not thought about in years. The tools were on the walls and on the workbench in the order Walter Osgood had left them. Chisels hanging on a pegboard size smallest to largest left to right. Planes arranged by type on a shelf. A set of clamps, wooden-jawed, handmade to a size that standard manufacturers didn't produce. Winding sticks, 2 thin, straight pieces of hardwood leaning against the wall near the bench. On the floor in the corner, 3 boards of white oak that had been there since before Walter died, waiting for a project that never started. Pearl stood in the doorway and let Willa look. "Walter didn't want anyone in here after he was gone," Pearl said eventually. "He thought it would be disrespectful to the work. 12 years I thought he was right." A pause. "He wasn't." She took the key from around her neck and held it out. Willa took it. The metal was warm from Pearl's skin. That night alone in the workshop with a single oil lamp, Willa sat on the workbench stool and held one of the pieces of white oak from the corner. It was dry. 12 years of workshop air had drawn the moisture out completely, and lighter than it looked, the way properly dried wood always is. She ran her thumb along the edge. Her grandfather, Ephraim Cald, had kept a workshop in a converted carriage house on the east side of Lexington, Kentucky, and Willa had spent 4 summers there as a girl from the time she was 9 until she was 13, and her mother decided she was old enough to help in the house instead. The summers in Ephraim's workshop were not structured as lessons. He did not sit her down and explain woodworking. He simply worked, and she watched, and occasionally he answered questions she asked without making the answers into more than they needed to be. She was 11 the summer she watched him sanding a table that someone had put out on the street for the trash hauler. The table was warped, the top had cupped across its width in a dramatic curve that would have made it useless, and the legs were mismatched from previous repairs, and the whole thing looked like a piece of furniture that had simply given up. She had asked him why he was spending time on it. He didn't answer immediately. He ran his hand along the grain slowly, the way she would later see a doctor palpate for something not yet visible, and the expression on his face was one of specific concentration, not general thoughtfulness. Ugly is usually just uninformed, he said finally. Wood doesn't have opinions about what we think of it. The question is whether you can see past what it looks like right now to what it wants to become. He smoothed a curl of shaving off the edge with the back of his hand. Most people can't do that. Not because they're lacking anything, because they've never learned to pay attention in the right direction. The ones who do never run out of material. She had stored that sentence somewhere deep and not thought about it consciously for 28 years. In Pearl's workshop in the lamplight, she thought about it now. The first book arrived from Eugene 3 weeks after she ordered it, a practical guide to furniture construction published in 1876, with chapters on joinery, wood selection, and finishing, and a set of hand-drawn illustrations that were precise, if not elegant. She read it in the evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close. She ordered a second book 2 weeks after the first. She found a used copy of a timber grading manual at the Harlan Crossing post office, where someone had left it on the exchange shelf, and she read that too. She bought a panel saw from the hardware store on Main Street, the only saw type the store carried that she could afford, and she brought it to Pearl's workshop and spent a Saturday afternoon learning its feel on pieces of scrap from the corner stack. The saw pulled to the right. She adjusted her grip. By the end of the afternoon, she could hold a reasonably straight line. She did not touch the delivery wood. The delivery wood needed time, and time was the first thing the books had made clear to her. Freshly cut hardwood is not wood in any usable sense. It is a living structure in the process of releasing moisture unevenly through its fibers, and as that moisture goes, the wood moves. It cups. It twists. It develops checks, small cracks running with the grain as the surface dries faster than the core. The standard figure she encountered in everything she read was 1 year of air-drying time per inch of thickness. The slabs coming off the Cascade timber truck were averaging 2 inches thick. She needed to wait 2 years before the first delivery slabs were reliably stable. She had 24 months before the court's debt deadline. The math did not work. She sat with that fact for several days and then set it aside because there was nothing in the sitting that changed it. The slabs she had available to work were the 3 pieces of dry white oak from Pearl's Corner, which Walter Osgood had left drying before his death. 12 years of workshop air had made them as stable as they were ever going to be. She would start with those. In May, she made a table. It took 11 days working in the evenings and on Saturdays, and the finished piece was wrong in several specific ways that she could identify clearly only after it was done. The apron, the frame that connected the legs beneath the tabletop, was slightly out of square, which made the whole structure look as though it was preparing to move in a direction it hadn't announced. The mortise and tenon joints at the leg corners were cut marginally too loose, which meant the glue was doing work that the joint should have done, which meant the joint was not reliable over time. The finish, she had used a linseed oil application as the book described, had gone on during 3 consecutive days of wet spring weather, and it had dried with a slight cloudiness across the grain that no amount of buffing would fully remove. She looked at the table for a long time after she was done looking at it. Then she went back to the book. The table sat in the corner of Pearl's workshop, and Willa did not show it to anyone, and she did not discuss it. And when Pearl asked how the work was going, Willa said it was going and left it at that. Hector Vane made his comment on a Thursday in early June, standing outside Pearl's front door when Pearl opened it in response to a knock. Willa was inside, visible through the window that Pearl had opened to let the morning air in. She heard his voice clearly. "I saw the light on in Walter's shop again last night. Quite late." A pause in which Pearl said nothing. "I hear the widow Drace is trying her hand at carpentry." The way he said it, the inflection he put on the word carpentry, as though it were a polite synonym for something more embarrassing, carried across the room. Pearl's response, whatever it was too quiet to hear. The door closed. Willa kept her eyes on the joint she was measuring. She did not put down the rule. She did not feel anger exactly. Anger was a reaction that required energy she was already spending elsewhere. She felt something more specific, a very clear awareness of the cost of failing publicly in a town where Hector Vane had nothing to do but watch, which meant she needed to not fail, or at least not fail where it could be observed. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without the lamp on, thinking about the table in Pearl's workshop corner, with its cloudy finish and its loose joints. about the 3 slabs of white oak that had been there 12 years and were the last of the dry material she had readily available, about the 2 years of delivery wood curing in her back field that she could not touch yet. She wrote a letter to her sister in Columbus, Ohio. Her sister was 3 years younger and lived with her husband in a house with a proper parlor and 2 children in school, a life that was settled in all the ways that Willa's was not. She wrote 3 paragraphs asking if there might be room for a visit. She wrote that she was trying something that might not work. She folded the letter, held it, read it again. Then she put it in the drawer of the kitchen table underneath the ledger and left it there. She was not going to Columbus. She was going to figure out what she was doing wrong with the joints. She found Silas Beaumont's chair on a Wednesday morning at the end of June in the corner of Pearl's workshop. It was not a notable chair from across the room. It was plain 4 legs aback with 3 vertical slats, a seat of figured white oak. But when Willa walked past it and stopped and looked at it directly, something about it refused to be explained by the description. The proportions were precisely right in a way that could only be fully appreciated in person, the way certain music is correctly described, but cannot be understood until you hear it. The joinery was invisible. She got on her knees and looked under the seat rail and could not find the joint lines, not because they were hidden by decorative work, but because they were so precisely cut and so correctly fitted that the wood itself appeared to be continuous. Pearl, when she finally asked, said, "Silas Beaumont. He lives out on Miner's Flat, the far end. Why haven't I heard his name before?" Pearl looked at her with the expression of a woman who has decided to let the question answer itself, and then seeing that Willa genuinely did not understand, said, "You've heard how this town looks at certain things." Willa had been in Harlan Crossing long enough to know what Pearl meant. Silas Beaumont was a black man in a timber town in Oregon in 1882, in a period when the social calculus of who was seen and how was enforced not by law alone, but by the 100 small habits of a community that had not seriously examined those habits. She had not heard his name because the people whose names she heard had chosen collectively and without discussion not to say it in the context where skill and reputation were being assigned. She would find him herself. She went to Miner's Flat on a Thursday morning in early July before 6, before the town was fully in motion. The road turned to packed dirt after the Mill Road fork, and the far end of Miner's Flat was a section of lots that had been allocated in the 1860s homestead period to people the town had subsequently found reasons to keep at its edges. There were 4 houses out there, 2 of them abandoned, one occupied by a family she didn't know, and at the end of the track a workshop house that was small but extremely well built, the kind of structure where every board was plumb and every corner was square, because the person who built it understood what square meant. Silas Beaumont was on his front step when she arrived, working a piece of wood with a spokes halve. He was 67, she would later learn, a big man who had aged into his size, in the way that people who have done physical work their whole lives sometimes do the weight settling correctly, the posture still carrying the memory of strength. His hands were extraordinary. She noticed them before she noticed anything else, the kind of hands that have done precise work for so long that the precision has become structural. He looked up when she stopped at the end of his path. He did not appear surprised. He waited. She told him about Pearl's workshop, about the delivery wood, about the table in the corner with the wrong joints and the cloudy finish. She told him what she was trying to do and why. She was not asking for charity. She was explaining a situation and making a request. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply decline without speaking. "Then why do you want to learn to pay a debt?" He considered that. "That's honest, at least." Another pause. "I don't teach people who are in a hurry. Hurry makes bad furniture." "I'm not in a hurry about the learning," Willa said. "I'm in a hurry about other things. Those are separate problems." He looked at her the way he looked at the piece of wood in his hand, with attention that was neither hostile nor particularly warm, just focused. "Come back Monday morning at 6. Don't bring anything. Don't ask anything. Just watch." She went back Monday. She sat on a stool in the corner of his workshop, which was larger than it looked from outside, with a window on the north wall that let in flat, consistent light, the kind of light that showed what was true, and she watched him work. He was making a coffin. This was not what she had expected, though she could not have said what she expected instead. The work was plain and serious, white pine, simple proportions, nothing decorative. He moved through the task with a completeness of attention that made the room feel quieter than it actually was. He did not perform for her. He did not explain. He simply worked, and she watched the way the wood responded to each cut, the way he repositioned his body before each pass of the plane, rather than fighting the grain from a bad angle, the way he stopped periodically and sighted down the surface before continuing. She came back Tuesday. He was repairing a chair, recutting a mortise that had been originally cut slightly off angle, resetting the joint so that the leg sat true. She watched him cut the old glue line free, pair the mortise with a chisel and strokes, so controlled they seemed barely to touch the wood dry, fit the joint 6 times before he opened the glue pot. She watched him apply the glue and set the clamp at an angle she would not have thought of, one that directed pressure exactly along the joint line rather than perpendicular to it. He checked the alignment. He set it down. He did not touch it again. She came back Wednesday. He sat in front of a slab of white oak for 40 minutes without touching it. She almost stood up at the half-hour mark. Something kept her seated, not patience exactly, but a sense that standing up would reveal something she didn't want revealed. At 41 minutes, Silas picked up a flat carpenter's pencil and drew a single line on the face of the slab following the grain in a curve that avoided a knot cluster that Willa had not noticed was there. He set down the pencil. He looked at her for the first time that morning. Now he said, "You can ask questions." She asked about the moisture. She asked about the delivery slabs in her back field, the timeline, the specific problem of having 2 years of curing ahead of her and 24 months of debt behind her. Silas listened to the full picture before responding. He told her that reading moisture in wood without instruments, there were no meters available in Harlan Crossing, was a matter of several combined signals. The weight relative to visual volume, the color of the freshly cut end grain, the feel of the surface, which conveyed more information than most people credited to touch. He had a method involving a small cut on the underside of a slab near the end grain, and a close examination of the exposed fiber green wood had a specific compression when pressed to resilience. Properly dried wood had gone past that resilience into something stiffer, the fibers having completed their contraction. He also told her that some of the slabs, depending on initial thickness and the specific conditions of the Oregon spring, which was drier than she might expect because of the rain-shadow effect on the east side of the Coast Range, might be approaching workable condition in 18 months rather than 24. Not all of them. She would need to check each one individually. She would be wrong about some. She would ruin a few slabs when she misjudged. "That's unavoidable," Silas said. "The only way to learn what the wood is telling you is to be wrong enough times that you start recognizing the signals before you make the cut." Willa looked at the slab he had drawn the pencil line on. "You're not wrong about slabs anymore." Silas picked up his chisel and set it against the marked line. "I've been wrong about enough of them that I had to stop being wrong." That sentence, she would think about it many times in the years that followed. It did not contain comfort exactly. What it contained was something more useful than comfort, a mechanism. Failure was not the opposite of knowledge. It was the cost of obtaining it, and the cost was non-negotiable. By the end of July, she was coming to Miner's Flat 3 mornings a week and spending her evenings in Pearl's workshop working through the problems Silas assigned her. Not projects problems, the correct angle to hold a chisel for a through mortise versus a blind mortise, the difference in technique between planing with the grain and across it, how to read the grain direction before any cut, because the wood would tell you if you looked in the right light, a slight variation in reflectance, one direction more lustrous than the other. And if you planed against that direction, the fibers tore rather than sheared. It was not intuition, it was information. She simply had to learn the language. She ruined 2 more pieces of dry oak from Pearl's corner stock before July was out. A joint cut at the wrong angle, a surface planed against the grain so that it tore and couldn't be fully recovered. Both mistakes were exactly the kind of mistakes Silas had said she would make. She went back to Pearl's workshop the morning after each one and started again. She had no idea in those evenings in the workshop, the lamp burning low sawdust on her hands, the particular smell of linseed oil, that she was already beginning to associate with something that resembled purpose, whether any of what she was building would be enough. She did not know if she would make furniture anyone would buy, or if she would make it in time, or if Hector Vane's fixed attention from across the fence line would eventually find a way to translate itself into something more concrete than watchfulness. What she knew was that the slabs were in the field curing. What she knew was that the wood in Pearl's workshop was teaching her things the books could describe but not convey. What she knew was that her grandfather, who had spent a summer's afternoon on a table someone had left for trash, had been right about something she was only beginning to understand the shape of. Ugly is usually just uninformed. The question is whether you can see past what it looks like right now. She looked at the delivery slabs on her way back to the house every Wednesday evening after the wagon had come and gone. She looked at the mineral streaks, the irregular edges, the dramatic grain figure that the flooring buyers had rejected as inconsistent. She looked at them the way Ephraim had taught her without teaching her, with the attention of someone trying to see past the present surface to the thing underneath it, the thing it had not become yet. She was still learning to look. She knew that, but she was looking. Every morning, every evening, in good light, in bad light, in the particular gray of an Oregon summer overcast, and in the thin gold of early sun on a clear day. She was paying attention, and she was getting better at knowing what she was paying attention to, and that the accumulation of it one Wednesday at a time was the only resource she had that she could count on to grow. The third table broke on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, not the way the first split had gone, that sharp report across the grain like a rifle crack. This one opened slowly, a seam appearing along the glue line over the course of 3 days in November of 1882, starting as a shadow at the joint and widening by degrees until by Thursday morning it was a gap Willa could fit a playing card into. She stood in Pearl's workshop in the early light looking at it, and the cold coming through the floorboards was the same temperature as the feeling behind her sternum. She had done everything correctly. She had checked the moisture on the slab twice using the method Silas had shown her, the small cut near the end grain, the compression test on the exposed fiber. She had cut the joint with the care she would use on something precious. She had glued up on a dry afternoon with the temperature above 50 degrees. She had clamped at the right angle. She had waited 36 hours before removing the clamps longer than necessary because she had learned to build in more time rather than less. The joint had still opened. She went to Silas that morning earlier than usual. He listened to the full account without moving. Then he put on his coat, walked the 2 miles to Pearl's workshop, looked at the table for 3 minutes, got down on his knees to look at the underside of the joint, stood back up. The clamp pressure was even, he said, not as a question. You checked it with a straight edge before the glue dried. She had. The moisture reading was correct. She believed it was. He was quiet for a long moment. The slab came from the outside of the log, near the bark. She nodded. She had noted that, thought it was acceptable. Wood from the outside of the log is under different tension than wood from the center. When you release it from the rest of the log, it wants to move back toward the shape it had before. Takes time, sometimes a year after milling. He looked at the gap again. You couldn't have known that from the books you have. I should have asked. His response carried more weight than a simple correction. You're learning to ask the right questions. That takes longer than learning the right answers. She took the table apart. She saved the legs, which were sound, and she set the slab aside to continue curing, marking it with a chalk notation on the end grain that she had developed her own shorthand for date of delivery, date of first check, what she had found. She started keeping a record of every slab in the field this way, a separate ledger from the account book, just the wood and what it was telling her at each examination. By December of 1882, the field held 47 slabs in various stages of drying, stacked in rows on wooden stickers, short cross pieces Silas had shown her to use to separate each layer, allowing air to circulate on all faces simultaneously. She had arranged them by delivery date, oldest at the east end, newest at the west, so she could work through them in order as they became usable. Walking the rows on a clear morning had begun to feel less like inventory and more like conversation. She could see the grain in each piece, the particular character of it, the figure that the flooring buyers had rejected as inconsistent, but that she was starting to read as individual. No two slabs were the same. She had known this abstractly. She was coming to understand it specifically the way knowing that fingerprints are unique is different from learning to read them. Winter in the workshop was cold. Pearl's building had no stove. Walter had never installed one, believing that heat fluctuation was bad for the work, which was true, but also meant that Willa worked in her coat until February. Her hands in the first weeks cracked at the knuckles from the combination of cold air and the tannins in white oak, which reacted with moisture from her skin. She learned to apply a small amount of the same linseed oil she used on finished surfaces to her hands at the end of each session. The cracks healed. She stopped noticing the cold. Silas came twice a week to see her work and correct what needed correcting. He did not praise. He identified errors with the precision of a man who understood that imprecision in the correction was as wasteful as imprecision in the cut. When she got something right, he moved on without comment, which she came to understand was its own form of acknowledgement. He only spent words on what required them. One afternoon in January of 1883, she completed a small side table using the first of the dry corner stock that she had not yet ruined. The joints were tight. The surface was flat. She had checked it with a straight edge in 3 directions. The linseed oil had gone on in 5 thin coats. Over 5 days each coat rubbed out before the next was applied on dry afternoons, with the workshop door open for air circulation. Silas ran his hand across the surface. He picked up the table, turned it over, examined the underside of the joints. He set it back down. "Do it again," he said. She looked at him. "The next one," he clarified. "Make another one. Don't change anything yet. Just make the same table again." She made the same table 3 more times over the following 2 months. By the 4th iteration, her hands moved through the sequence without the deliberate conscious effort that the first one had required. The mortises were cut cleaner, not because she was thinking harder about them, but because her hands had learned something her mind couldn't fully articulate yet. Repetition had compressed the knowledge from decision into reflex. Hector Vane filed his motion in November of 1883. Willa found out the way most things in Harlan Crossing were found out. Someone mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to Pearl, who came to the workshop on a Thursday afternoon with a face that said she was carrying something uncomfortable. Vane had retained Harvey Tull, a land and property attorney who practiced out of an office above the barbershop, to argue a position regarding the gypsum and timber materials accumulating on the Drace property. The position was this: Thomas Drace's estate remained in a legally unsettled condition with respect to a specific promissory note and the materials accumulating on estate property, since the note's origination could be construed as estate assets, subject to satisfaction of outstanding debts. The argument was thin. Willa understood immediately the language of the transfer agreement with Amos Gettrick was explicit about the 60-day ownership provision. But thin arguments in 1883 Oregon still required responses, and responses required time she didn't have, and money she didn't possess, specifically $12 for Harvey Tull's counterpart at the end of Main Street. She sat with the information overnight. In the morning, she went to Amos Gettrick at the mill. She did not apologize for coming without prior arrangement. She laid the situation out in plain terms. A party was arguing a position about the ownership of materials on her property, and that position depended on the transfer language in their agreement being interpreted as something other than what it said. She needed his written confirmation of what the agreement actually meant. Amos listened with the expression of a man who dislikes complications that originate outside his control. He read the agreement. He read the specific provision. He picked up a pen, wrote a single clarifying paragraph on mill letterhead, confirming that all materials delivered to the Drace property transferred to Willicalt Drace's sole ownership 60 days after delivery, that no lien or conditional interest was retained by Cascade Timber Company, that this had been the explicit intent of the arrangement from its inception. He signed it. He handed it across the desk without expression. "I don't involve myself in property disputes between neighbors," he said, which was as close as Amos Gettrick came to taking a side. Willa took the document to the attorney's office and watched Harvey Tull read it, watched his expression go through a specific sequence that ended in something resembling resigned professionalism. Vane's position collapsed. The motion was withdrawn within 10 days. The victory cost her $12. She pulled from the end of a sequence of careful economies, skipped supply orders, 2 evenings of resoling her own boots, rather than paying the cobbler the kind of mathematics that people who have a margin never have to do. She did not spend time being angry about the $12. She noted it in the account ledger and moved forward. What she did think about more than the legal outcome was the nature of the attack. It was not random. It was calculated to cost her resources she didn't have: time, money, attention, during a period when every one of those resources was being stretched. Someone with $85 worth of reason to see her fail had decided that a direct method was available. She told none of this to Silas, but when she arrived at his workshop the following Monday morning, he looked at her once and didn't ask any questions. She had her dark night in October of 1883. though she would not have called it that at the time. She would have called it arithmetic. The debt deadline was 10 months away, August of 1884. She pulled out the account ledger on a Sunday evening and went through it with the kind of attention she had once given to the restaurant accounts in Cincinnati, the same pencil and column discipline, the same refusal to allow hope to interfere with the numbers. She had $31 in the tin on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet. She had 14 slabs that Silas had assessed as within 2 months of workable condition, which meant she could begin cutting into them by December. Each finished table represented approximately 3 to 4 weeks of work depending on complexity. Between December and August, at that rate, she could produce 8 to 10 finished pieces if nothing went wrong. No failed joints, no ruined surfaces, no new setbacks of the kind that had been her consistent companion for 18 months. The problem was that she had no buyers. She had no channel to buyers. She had a workshop behind a neighbor's house, a growing pile of wood that was becoming usable, a set of skills that were demonstrably better than they had been in March of 1882, but that had not yet been tested against the judgment of anyone with money to spend on furniture. She could take the finished pieces to Eugene. She could display them at the market there. She could price them and stand beside them and watch people walk past. She could also sell the dry corner stock and the workable delivery slabs as raw lumber, not at premium prices, but at something. Enough potentially combined with the $5 monthly payments that had continued all year to cover a portion of the remaining debt. She could request another extension from the court, which had granted one already. She could try to negotiate the remaining balance against the assessed value of the property itself. She wrote the letter to her sister in Columbus. This time she wrote 4 paragraphs. She explained the situation without softening it. She asked if the offer from 2 years ago still stood the spare room, the possibility of starting again in a city where she was known at least by family. She put the letter in the envelope. She addressed it. She set it on the kitchen table. She sat with it for an hour. Then she took it apart at the seam the way you open an envelope you've sealed by accident, and she put it in the stove. She was not going to Columbus. What she felt sitting in the kitchen in the dark after the letter was ash was not courage. Courage implied a choice between options that both remained available. What she felt was a specific, almost structural recognition. She had been building something in Pearl's workshop for 18 months, learning something that could not be unlearned, accumulating something that had no value if she walked away from it. The sunk cost argument would have told her to stop, to cut her losses, to make the rational choice. But the sunk cost argument assumed that what she'd put in was lost if she continued to fail. She had begun to suspect it wasn't. She had begun to suspect that what she had put in was not gone. It was present in her hands in the way she now read grain direction before a cut, in the way she set a clamp. It was not lost. It was waiting to be worth something. She went to bed. She got up at 5 and went to the workshop. The 4 tables she completed between December of 1883 and March of 1884 were the best things she had made. Not because she was trying harder, she had been trying hard since the beginning. Because the trying had finally connected to a kind of knowing that made effort efficient rather than exhausting. She cut the joints correctly the first time more often than not. She read the grain before each pass of the plane and confirmed it rather than discovered it. The finish on the March table, a figured white oak surface with a linseed and beeswax combination she had worked out through 3 iterations, caught the light in a way that made Pearl stand in the doorway for a moment before she said anything. Walter would have been interested in that finish, Pearl said finally. Willa, who by then knew Pearl well enough to hear the weight behind the understatement, accepted the observation as what it was. She loaded the 4 tables into a borrowed wagon in late April and drove to Eugene. The market was held in a lot adjacent to the commercial district on Willamette Street, and the sellers ranged from farm produce to dry goods to craft work of varying quality. She paid 50 cents for a table space, set her pieces up, put a price card on each one, and spent the day standing beside them while the market moved around her. She sold nothing. She drove back to Harlan Crossing in the early evening with the 4 tables still in the wagon, which was in some ways worse than if one had broken a brake, at least contained specific information she could act on. The market's silence told her only that she had brought furniture to a place where the people looking at furniture had not been moved to buy hers. She went back in May. Different arrangement, corner position near the entrance rather than the middle row. The same result for most of the day. A woman in her 50s stopped and ran her hand across the surface of the figured oak coffee table, exactly the way Ephraim had run his hand across the trash day table in Lexington. That slow, deliberate reading, and then kept walking. An hour later, a young couple stopped and asked the price and walked away. At 2 in the afternoon, Della Marsh appeared with her husband coming from the dry goods section. Della was 54, the wife of the largest cattle operation north of Harlan Crossing, a woman who had furnished a 4-bedroom farmhouse through 30 years of catalog orders and understood the difference between a piece of furniture built to specification and a piece of furniture built with attention. She walked around the coffee table. She crouched down and looked at the underside of the piece, the joint construction, the way the apron was attached. She stood back up. "What's the wood?" Willa told her. "Where did it come from?" Willa explained the arrangement with Cascade Timber, the delivery slabs, the air drying process. Della listened with the focused attention of someone who has managed inventory and supply chains on a working ranch. "How long did this particular slab dry before you worked it?" 22 months. I checked it with a moisture assessment at 18 and again at 21. Della looked at the piece one more time. $3.50, she said, which was the price on the card. The $3.50 that Willa received for the table barely covered the cost of the Eugene trip and the market fee. But Della Marsh set the table in the front room of the farmhouse, where visitors came in from the main road, which meant that every person who entered the Marsh house that summer walked past it, many of them touching it or asking about it. Della, who was not a woman who promoted things without reason, told people who asked that she had bought it in Eugene from a furniture maker in Harlan Crossing who was doing something worth seeing with wood that the mill had thrown away. News moves strangely in small communities. Sometimes it moved like water, finding every low point, filling every gap. Sometimes it moved like smoke, reaching places you couldn't predict by any logical path. Josephine Hart came through Harlan Crossing in September of 1884. She was 44, ran an interior furnishing business out of Eugene that served the wealthier households and commercial properties of the mid-Willamette Valley, and she was in Harlan Crossing to assess a commission for a hotel renovation in the valley town of Halsey. She stayed one night at the Marsh house because Della was a client. She noticed the coffee table in the front room. She asked Della who made it. Della told her. The following morning, before her departure, Josephine Hart appeared at Pearl's workshop. Willa heard the knock at 6:20 and opened the door to find a woman in a gray traveling coat who looked at the interior of the workshop before she looked at Willa with the assessing attention of someone cataloging assets. She walked through the space without being invited, which another person might have found presumptuous. Willa recognized it as professional habit, the movement of someone who evaluated spaces for a living. She stopped at the 2 pieces Willa currently had in progress. She looked at the stack of slabs against the back wall, the ones approaching readiness. She looked at the finished side table Pearl had accepted as a permanent fixture in the workshop corner. 10 minutes of silence, or what passed for silence, the sounds of the workshop, the morning birds, Pearl's rooster at the far end of the property. Then Josephine turned from the side table. Lead time for a dining set, 6 chairs, a table to seat 8. 6 weeks from the point I have the right slabs available. Willa had thought about this, already had thought about what she would say if anyone ever asked something like this. The way you rehearse a response to a question you are not sure will come. Josephine's voice carried what it always carried, which was the efficiency of someone who had learned that directness was a form of respect. I want it innate. I'd rather have the work done right than done fast. A pause. I have 3 clients currently looking for dining room pieces. I've been looking for a supplier who understands natural materials for 2 years. I haven't found one that I trust. She looked back at the side table in the corner. I'm not certain you can hold this quality at a larger scale, but I think it's worth finding out. Willa's chest tightened in the particular way of a person receiving something they have needed for a long time. I'll hold it. Josephine reached into the bag she carried and produced a card. Send me word when you're ready to begin. I'll come back to discuss the commission in detail. She left. Pearl, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, said nothing for a long moment. Then Walter would have recognized her. Willa set the card on the workbench beside her tools. So did I. The problem with the Josephine commission was specific and immediately practical. Willa did not have the slabs. She had slabs that were close. She had 2 pieces of white oak that her November moisture checks put at potentially workable by December. She had a third that might be ready by January. For a dining table to seat 8, she needed a slab of minimum 24 inches in width and at least 6 feet in length with consistent figure and stable moisture through the full thickness. She walked the field rows that evening, lamp in hand, checking each piece with the same end-grain examination Silas had taught her, pressing her thumbnail into the exposed fiber, holding the lamp close to read the color. The piece she needed was there, had been there since February of 1883, nearly 22 months of curing on the stickers at the far east end of the field, the oldest delivery in the stack. She had been watching it for 4 months, noting at each check that it was close but not ready. Under the lamp that evening, pressing the fiber, studying the color of the fresh cut, it was ready. She went back inside. She lit the kitchen lamp and sat at the table and made a list of what the commission required. 6 chair frames, each needing matched pieces for the legs, back posts, seat rails, and slat construction. A table base, the apron and leg assembly from secondary stock, preferably the same white oak family, but not requiring the premium figure she would use for the top. The top itself from the big slab at the east end of the field. 60 days was achievable. 8 weeks gave her margin. She told Silas the following Monday morning, laying out the sequence of the work with the same ledger precision she applied to the financial accounts. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she began to anticipate a problem she hadn't identified. "You can do the table," he said. "The chairs will take longer than you're planning. Chairs are harder than tables." She had read this. She had not fully believed it until his tone confirmed it. Every joint in a chair is under stress in multiple directions simultaneously. A table joint carries weight in one direction. A chair carries weight side force, racking force, every time someone shifts their position. The margins for error are smaller. "What's the specific problem I'll run into?" His answer was exact: the back post mortise, where the seat rail meets the back leg. The angle changes relative to the vertical depending on the chair back angle. If you cut it at 90 degrees, you'll have a chair that feels wrong to sit in. If you cut it at the correct compound angle without a jig to hold the piece, you'll be wrong by enough to matter. He paused. "I'll make you a jig." He spent 3 afternoons on the jig, a holding device made from scrap oak that captured the chair back leg at the precise compound angle and held it immovable while the mortise was cut. When he handed it to her, it was as precisely made as any finished piece in the workshop. "You could sell this," Willa told him. Something shifted in his expression, not quite humor, but adjacent to it. "I did once. Richmond, Virginia, 1864. He did not say more about that. She worked through November at a pace that had nothing wasteful in it. Calvin Pratt, who did carpentry work for several of the ranches outside town, came through Pearl's workshop in the second week of November, looking for a chisel sharpening stone that Pearl had mentioned she possessed. He stayed 40 minutes watching Willa cut chair back legs. At the end of 40 minutes, he asked if she needed help with rough cuts on the secondary stock. Calvin was 34, plain-spoken, with hands that had spent 12 years building and repairing structures on working ranches. He understood wood as a construction material in the way that people who have used it constantly understand anything, not theoretically but practically, through the accumulated experience of solving problems with it. He was not a furniture maker. He would not need to be for what Willa required. She offered him a percentage of the commission payment for specific tasks: rough dimensioning of the chair components from secondary stock sticker, stacking the cut pieces for the brief interim drying before assembly, sanding the secondary surfaces where precision wasn't required. He agreed without negotiating, which told her he was interested in the work beyond the payment. His sister Ruth came the following week, drawn by curiosity and by the fact that she had been doing rough carpentry alongside Calvin since she was 16, and did not see why a commission of this scale shouldn't involve both of them. She was 28, quieter than her brother, with the kind of spatial precision that showed in everything she built. Her nail lines were straight without snapping a chalk line first. Willa did not have the money to pay them what the work was worth. She showed them the account ledger, the commission payment from Josephine, the expected further commissions if the work satisfied her clients, the projected income against the projected timeline. She offered them each a percentage structure that increased with each confirmed subsequent commission. It was not a standard arrangement for 1884. It was the arrangement that made the math work without lying about it. They looked at the ledger. They looked at each other with the particular communication of people who have worked together long enough to share a language that doesn't require words. "Calvin, when do we start, Chesham?" The dining set came together through December and into the first week of January 1885. The tabletop came out of the big slab the way Willa had imagined it during the months of watching it cure the figure in the grain, which had been visible as a faint suggestion in the raw slab, became explicit under the hand plane, the flame pattern shimmering as the angle of light across it changed. It was not a uniform surface. It was a record of the specific conditions under which that particular tree had grown, the periods of drought that compressed the growth rings, the lateral stresses that produced the figure 60-odd years of specific weather in a specific place. No catalog could produce it. No mill run could replicate it. It was one piece, and when it was finished and oiled, it occupied the center of Pearl's workshop floor and made the room feel different. Pearl stood in the doorway in the January cold and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Ruth Pratt, carrying a chair frame over from the drying area, stopped and looked at it too. The chair frame in her hands, which she had been moving with the casual efficiency of someone transporting material, she set down with more care than the task required. The 6 chairs were correct. The back post mortise jig worked precisely as Silas had designed it, and the joints at the critical compound angle were tight through all 6 pieces, checked individually against a straight edge laid across each seat in both directions. The seat rails were pegged as well as glued, an additional security that Silas had insisted on for anything that would bear human weight repeatedly over years. Willa assembled the final chair on a Tuesday evening in the second week of January, fitted the back slats, set the piece on the floor, sat in it. She sat in it for a long minute. Then she stood up. She went out to the backfield with a lamp, even though the January cold was the hardest kind. Not deep cold, but the wet kind, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your neck. She walked the rows of stacked slabs, holding the lamp close to each chalk notation, updating the records. Delivery date, current assessment, projected readiness. There were 31 slabs still curing. The oldest of the remaining ones would be ready by April. She had Josephine's commission to deliver in January. She had, if Josephine's network operated the way Willa was beginning to understand it, operated more commissions coming after that. She had Calvin and Ruth, who were no longer just help with rough cuts, but were learning the sequence, absorbing it through repetition the way Willa had absorbed it. She had a debt deadline in August of 1884 that had since been amended by the court to December. The partial payment from Josephine's deposit made when the commission was confirmed had been enough to demonstrate good faith. 31 slabs on stickers, 2 people who understood the work, 1 commission about to be delivered, 1 piece of furniture sitting on Pearl's workshop floor that was better than anything Willa had made before it. The math was still tight. It was always going to be tight. That was the nature of building something with only what was at hand. She went back inside. She delivered the dining set to Josephine Hart's warehouse in Eugene on a Thursday in late January. Calvin driving the borrowed freight wagon, Ruth sitting in the back, keeping the chairs steady through the ruts on the road south. The delivery itself was without ceremony. Josephine met them at the warehouse, walked through the pieces with a methodical attention that was the professional version of the attention Willa gave to wood testing each joint with hand pressure, sighting down each surface, sitting in each chair in turn. At the end of it, Josephine looked at the tabletop for a long moment. "This figure," she said, not asking, noting, "this isn't something you chose from a supplier catalog. It came from the specific slab that had those growth conditions. I've been watching it for 22 months. Josephine was quiet. Then, "I have a client who has been trying to describe to me for 2 years what he wants in a dining room. He keeps saying he wants something that looks like it grew from the land it sits in, not something that was manufactured somewhere." She looked at the tabletop one more time. "I think this is what he means." The client she was describing was Gordon Ashby, though Willa did not learn his name until 2 weeks later, when Josephine sent a letter confirming a meeting. He was 58, had made his money in land development along the Willamette Valley. Through the 1870s, was building 4 substantial homes on properties in the valley's northeastern section, and had reached the furnishing stage of 2 of them with a clear idea of what he wanted aesthetically, but no clear idea of where to obtain it. He came to Harlan Crossing on a Wednesday. He arrived the same morning the Cascade timber wagon came down the track. Different driver now, a younger man, who said even less than Ket had. The slab came off the flatbed with a familiar sound, and Willa was on the porch with her coffee when Ashby's horse came around the side of the house, following Josephine's written directions. He stopped his horse and looked at the slab on the ground, looked at the rows of stacked material in the field, looked at the workshop building. He did the kind of arithmetic that certain men do automatically. The arithmetic that isn't about sentiment, but about what a situation actually contains. When he looked at Willa, it was with the directness of someone who has reached a conclusion. Can you scale this? The question carried the weight of genuine assessment, not challenge. I need more people, not hedging accounting. Then get them. He looked back at the field. I have 2 dining rooms, a study, and a library across 4 properties. I want pieces that look like they came from this part of Oregon. I want nothing that could have come from a catalog. He named a price per commission. It was a fair price, which told her he was not trying to exploit her need, which told her he understood the difference between a supplier relationship and a transaction. She looked at him steadily. Delivery on the first 2 sets in 14 weeks, the second 2 after that. He extended his hand. She shook it. She stood in the field after he left the coffee long cold in her mug, looking at the rows of slabs on their stickers. 31 pieces, 3 people who knew the work. 1 new commission large enough to clear the remaining debt entirely with margin remaining. The wood had been here curing the whole time. The slabs were unchanged from the ones that Ket had delivered season after season without ceremony or explanation. What had changed was the accumulation of everything between that first miscut piece of green oak in May of 1882 and this January morning in 1885. Every failed joint, every ruined surface, every correction Silas had offered without softening it, every evening in the workshop past the point of good light, every entry in the chalk ledger on the end grain of a slab that wasn't ready yet. None of that was gone. It was present in the way she stood looking at the wood, in the way she already knew which slabs Ashby's library pieces would come from, in the way she could hold the shape of 14 weeks in her mind and see where the problems would be before they arrived. Patience applied over time, she was learning, doesn't disappear when the waiting ends. It becomes judgment. It becomes the ability to see what something is becoming while it still looks like what it is. She went inside to find Calvin, who was already in the workshop. The debt was paid on a Thursday in June of 1885. Willa walked out of the Harlan Crossing County Courthouse into air that smelled of cut grass from the lot next door. The same air. It had always been the same street, with the same buildings, in the same positions they had occupied every day of the 5 years she had lived in this town. Nothing had changed in the visible world. The receipt in her coat pocket, $140, in full satisfaction of the remaining balance stamped with the court seal, signed by the clerk with the spectacles who had read the original figure to her in September of 1881, was the only evidence that the thing had shifted. She had expected to feel something cleaner than what she felt. Relief was there, but it sat underneath something more complex, a residue of all the mornings she had gotten up before the thing was resolved. The months of arithmetic that didn't quite work. The letter she had written to her sister in Columbus and then burned in the kitchen stove. The receipt was proof that those mornings had accumulated into something. It was not proof that the accumulation was finished. If anything, it clarified that it had barely started. Hector Vane was coming out of his store when she crossed the main block. He saw her. She saw him see her. Neither of them spoke. He went back inside. That was all. Pearl was waiting on the front porch of her house when Willa came up the lane, which meant Pearl had known the court date and had been watching the road. She had 2 cups of coffee on the porch rail. She handed one to Willa without ceremony, the way she always did, without making the gesture into more than it was. They stood on the porch and drank the coffee. Pearl looked out at the field behind Willa's property, at the rows of stickered slabs that had been curing through winter and spring, the chalk notations visible as pale marks on the end grain of each piece. Walter would have wanted to see those rows, Pearl said finally. Willa held the warm cup between both palms. I know. The Ashby commissions took 14 weeks as she had promised, then 16 more for the second pair. Calvin had by that point absorbed enough of the finishing sequence that he could apply the linseed and beeswax coats without supervision. His instinct for when a coat had cured sufficiently before the next was applied, coming from the same kind of tactile intelligence that had made him useful with rough cuts from the beginning. Ruth's eye for alignment had developed into something more formal. She had begun making her own winding sticks, a matched pair slightly longer than the set Silas had given Willa, and she used them on every surface before Willa did the final check, catching the issues before they reached that stage. This was the thing about people who understood physical work. They didn't need to be taught principles, so much as given the right context for the knowledge they already possessed. Ruth had been reading flat surfaces for squareness since she was a teenager helping Calvin true up barn floors. The winding sticks were simply a formalization of something she had already been doing by eye. Gordon Ashby paid promptly on each delivery, which was not universal among clients of his standing men who had made money through land development in the 1870s, often carried habits of delayed payment that reflected their experience of leverage. Ashby was not like that. He understood that a supplier who was paid fairly would remain available. He mentioned Colt Woodworks to his associates with the brevity of a man who does not need to oversell what speaks for itself. The name had been Josephine's practical question answered with the only answer that made sense. Willa had spent 9 years carrying the name Drace, which she associated with a debt that had occupied the center of her life for nearly 4 years. The Colt in Colt Woodworks was her grandfather's surname. Her mother's father's name, the man who had run his hand across a discarded table on a Lexington street in the summer of 1872, and said something that had taken Willa 28 years to fully need. It was not sentiment exactly. It was accuracy, a correct attribution of where the understanding had come from. Octa. By the autumn of 1885, the backlog stood at 6 weeks. By winter, it was 8. In the spring of 1886, a furniture buyer from a commercial importer in Portland came through Harlan Crossing. On other business heard Colt Woodworks mentioned at the hotel, came to the workshop on a Tuesday morning, walked through the pieces in progress, left a card, sent a letter 3 weeks later, inquiring about supply volume. Willa read the letter, set it aside, replied that she was not presently in a position to fill volume orders, that her work was commission-based, that she appreciated the inquiry. She discussed it with Silas that week. He listened to the full account, including the volume figures the Portland buyer had named. What did you feel when you read the letter, not sentiment diagnosis? She had felt the specific anxiety of being asked to become something different from what she was currently building, toward the anxiety of a path that led away from the thing that had produced the backlog in the first place. She described it that way. Volume means consistent stock, Silas said. You don't have consistent stock. You have what the mill discards, which is irregular by definition. That's not a limitation. That's the reason your work is what it is. She already knew this. Hearing it confirmed by someone whose judgment she had come to trust completely was still useful, not because it changed anything, but because it named the thing clearly. The irregularity of the source material was not a problem to be solved through scaling. It was the condition from which everything valuable about the work emerged. Cascade Timber's buyers rejected the flame figure and the mineral streaks and the live edges because they couldn't be replicated at volume. The people who sought out Colt Woodworks sought it out for exactly those things. She wrote back to this Portland buyer declining the arrangement. She did not apologize for the decline. Hector Vane sold his store in March of 1886. Pearl told Willa on a Wednesday morning, which was how Pearl tended to deliver information she had been sitting with for a few days on a Wednesday, because Wednesdays Willa was home when the Cascade wagon came, and Pearl knew she would be on the porch with coffee. The buyer was a man from Corvallis expanding his mercantile operation northward. Vane had negotiated a price that was reportedly lower than the property's assessed value, which told Willa everything she needed to know about the urgency of his departure. The promissory note between Thomas and Vane had been legally discharged when Willa paid the primary debt in full, and the court closed the estate. Vane had never recovered the $85 which was in the order of things he had signed the note without reading it carefully, which was his own error, not hers. But the $85 wasn't really the point. The point was that for 4 years he had positioned himself as an obstacle, and the obstacle had not worked, and now the space where he had stood was occupied by a man from Corvallis who had no history with Willa one way or the other. Frank Oberg, the town's senior blacksmith, watched Vane's wagon go from in front of the forge and offered no commentary to the small group that had gathered, which was its own form of comment. Frank had been among the first to note the Wednesday deliveries in the spring of 1882. He had told Pearl at the time that the widow Drace was building herself a fine collection of firewood. He had not said anything like that in several years. The first piece of journalism came from a regional correspondent who wrote a column for the Oregon Statesman in Eugene, a woman named Cordelia Marsh, no relation to Della, who covered commerce and trade in the Willamette Valley's smaller communities. She had heard about Colt Woodworks from Josephine Hart, who had mentioned it in passing during an unrelated interview about the valley's decorative trade. The correspondent came to Harlan Crossing in June of 1886, Spent a morning at the workshop, wrote 9 paragraphs that ran in the Statesman the following week under the heading, Mill Discards to Heirloom Pieces. Willa had not been told the article was running. Pearl brought her a copy at the workshop on the day it appeared, the paper folded open to the page. Willa read it standing at the workbench with a chisel still in her hand. The correspondent had described the work accurately, the source material, the air-drying timeline, the commission process, the irregular figure that commercial buyers rejected. She had also described Willa in terms that Willa found slightly more elevated than she felt was warranted, but she understood that journalism needed a shape, and the shape the correspondent had chosen was not inaccurate, only compressed. What the article produced within 2 weeks of publication was 4 letters of inquiry and 2 visitors who appeared at the workshop without prior contact. One of the visitors was a woman from Salem who was furnishing a newly built home. One was a purchasing agent for a Portland hotel whose owners were renovating their dining room. The purchasing agent wanted 12 tables of consistent specification, which Willa declined for the same reason she had declined the volume inquiry from Portland the previous year. The woman from Salem wanted a writing desk, a library table, a set of 4 chairs. They discussed the commission in the workshop doorway for 20 minutes, settled on the details, settled on the price. The backlog went to 4 months. Silas came to the workshop on a Tuesday in October of 1886 and stayed longer than usual. He did this occasionally now, not to correct, not to instruct, but simply to occupy the space while the work happened around him. Willa had come to understand this as something different from what it had been in the early years of their work together. In the beginning, his presence in the workshop was authority, the person who knew what she didn't know, the standard against which her errors were measured. Now his presence in the workshop was continuity. He was the through line between the first failed table in Pearl's corner and the commissions on the current bench. He was 71 in the autumn of 1886, and the years showed in his hands more than anywhere else. The joints were stiffer, the range of movement in the wrists slightly reduced. He could still plane a surface to a standard that Willa measured herself against. He had simply slowed, not diminished. She was working the back leg of a chair, the compound mortise that his jig had been designed to solve, when he spoke from the stool in the corner where he took his coffee. "Your grandfather," he said. "The thing he told you about the wood." She kept the chisel moving, but her attention shifted. "I remember it. He wasn't talking about wood." She had known this for some time. Had known it the way you know something that has gradually revealed itself through repeated confirmation, not a single moment of understanding, but an accumulation of moments that eventually passed the threshold of certainty. The wood was the vehicle. The instruction was about attention, about the capacity to see past the current condition of a thing to what it was capable of becoming. You could apply it to a warped table someone had left for the trash hauler. You could apply it to 40 acres of basalt underlaid hillside in eastern Oregon. You could apply it to a widow with $12 in a tin, a pile of discarded slabs, 1 borrowed key, 1 old man's unwilling but real patience. She set down the chisel. "I know." Silas held his coffee cup in both hands the way he had held tools for 50 years, with the deliberate grip of someone who had learned that attention was the same thing as care. The people who understand that it isn't about the wood, they're rarer than the ones who understand it about the wood. She looked at him across the workshop. Outside, through the north-facing window, the afternoon light was the particular flat gray of an Oregon October, the kind of light that showed everything truly. He was an old man who had come to the far edge of a town that didn't know what to do with him, who had built coffins for the poor because it was the work available, who had given his best jig to a widow from Kentucky, who knocked on his door before 6 in the morning because she had no other option. What he had given her was not furniture knowledge, though it included that. What he had given her was the precedent of his own life, the proof that the work itself was worth doing independent of what the world offered in return, because the world's accounting was provisional where the work was not. She didn't say any of that. Some things are spoken, and some things are simply known between people who have spent enough time in the same room. In the spring of 1887, Josephine Hart brought a new client to Harlan Crossing without prior notice, which had become by now something Willa anticipated rather than resented. Josephine's version of introduction was always the same. She delivered the person to the workshop door and stepped back because she understood that what she was selling was not herself as intermediary, but the work itself, and the work spoke most clearly without intermediary. The client this time was a man named Aldous Price, 62, who had built his money through cattle brokerage in the 1860s, spent the next decade purchasing land in eastern Oregon, and was now in the process of constructing a large residence on a hill property outside the town of Junction City. He wanted furnishings for a library, a study, a formal dining room. He had been to furniture importers in Portland and San Francisco and had found nothing that satisfied a requirement he had difficulty articulating until standing in Cole Woodworks with the spring morning coming through the north window, he articulated it without prompting. Everything I've seen looks like it could have come from anywhere. I want something that could only have come from here. Willa looked at him directly. Every piece I make could only have come from here. The specific slab, the specific conditions that produced the figure in it, the specific year it dried on those stickers in that field. There's no catalog version. He walked through the current commissions in progress. He stopped at a library table in its middle stages, the top slab showing a figure that had emerged during planing that week. A pattern in the grain so pronounced it looked almost architectural. He put his hand flat on the surface, the way people did when they encountered it for the first time, testing whether what they were seeing was actually there to be felt. How long has this slab been curing? 26 months. He removed his hand, looked at the surface, put his hand back, a man trying to understand what he was touching. I want this one, whatever it becomes. The commission Aldous Price signed for that afternoon was the largest single order Cole Woodworks had received. Willa went through the numbers in the account ledger that evening with the same pencil and column precision she had maintained for 6 years, and when she was done, she sat back from the table. The backlog with the Price commission added was 5 months. She needed a third person not for rough cuts, but for the secondary joinery, the chairwork, the parts of the process that Calvin had learned to a sufficient standard, but that Ruth couldn't yet hold at the quality level the Price commission required. She made a note in the margin of the ledger. She would find someone. She had learned to trust that the right person appeared when she had clearly identified what she needed. Aktier. The court records were formally closed in August of 1887. The estate of Thomas Drace legally discharged in full the 40 acres released into Willa's unencumbered ownership for the first time since the original homesteading. She received a letter from the court clerk to this effect. She read it at the kitchen table, folded it, put it in the box where she kept significant documents. She noted it in the ledger. Then she went to the workshop where Calvin was setting clamps on a chair-back assembly that would need to sit undisturbed until morning. She looked at the assembly. She looked at the angle of the clamps. She moved one clamp 2 inches toward the joint line, checked the pressure with a quarter turn of her thumb. Correct. Calvin watched her adjustment without comment. He had learned over 2.5 years that Willa's corrections were not criticism. They were the same kind of precise information that Silas had once given her, offered the same way without editorial. He made a note in the small pocket ledger he had begun keeping of his own recording, the specifics of each adjustment so the pattern would eventually transfer from instruction to instinct. She saw him make the note. She didn't say anything about it. She recognized the habit. In September of 1887, Frank Oberg stopped by the workshop for the first time. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not a delivery day, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the interior before he stepped inside. He was 68, had been the town blacksmith since 1869, had seen everything that had happened in Harlan Crossing in the intervening 18 years, with the particular comprehensive visibility of a person whose trade required people to come to him. He walked slowly through the space, looking at the pieces in progress, at the stacked secondary stock along the back wall, at the tools hanging in the order Walter Osgood had established, and that Willa had maintained exactly. He stopped at a dining table top in its final finishing stages. The fourth coat of the linseed and beeswax combination rubbed out to the flat sheen that Willa had developed through 30 iterations over 5 years. The flame figure in the grain caught the afternoon light coming through the north window and held it differently than a flat surface holds it, the pattern seeming to move as he shifted his angle of view. He stood there long enough that Ruth, carrying a set of chair rails from the drying stack, stopped and waited to see if she should continue past him. He didn't notice. He was looking at the tabletop the way people looked at it the first time, with the specific attention of someone confronting something they did not expect. Finally, he turned from the table. He looked at Willa with an expression that was not comfortable but was honest. I said once that you were building a firewood collection. He did not look away while he said it. I had no idea. Willa handed him a cup of coffee from the pot Pearl kept on the small stove in the workshop corner, the stove that Willa had installed in the winter of 1885, after Pearl pointed out that working in a coat for 4 months was unnecessary stubbornness. Neither did I, not at the start. He accepted the cup. He looked at the tabletop one more time. Whatever he was recalibrating his understanding of what he had been watching for 5 years. His sense of what had been happening 30 yards east of his store while he stood in the doorway and assessed it through the lens of everything he already believed. He did it quietly without requiring assistance. That was all. No apology exchanged, none needed. Just a man standing in a workshop in October light revising his account of what he had seen. October of 1887. The Wednesday morning the final slab came. Not literally the final one, the Cascade timber wagon would continue its Wednesday deliveries for years to come. Amos Gettrick, having found no reason to alter an arrangement that solved his disposal problem cleanly. But this was the morning that Willa would think of later as the one that closed the circle, the way certain mornings arrange themselves in retrospect into meaning that wasn't visible in the moment. The new driver was 23 with the lean efficiency of someone recently hired who wanted to demonstrate competence. He lowered the wagon bed with practiced speed. The slab came off the flatbed and hit the ground with the sound that had opened every Wednesday for 5.5 years. That particular resonance of dense hardwood meeting, packed earth, a sound Willa now heard with the same readiness she brought to everything else in the morning routine. She was on the porch. Coffee in hand, the barn boots, the canvas coat she had replaced twice since the first winter, this version worn through at both elbows. Same posture she'd had the first Wednesday in the spring of 1882, when she'd stood watching Ket unload without knowing what she was looking at. The slab was white oak, wide nearly 30 inches across the maximum span, narrowing toward the live edge, where the bark curved in a long, slow arc that had been part of the tree's outermost growth ring. The flame figure was immediately visible, even from the porch distance, the grain pattern dense enough to look three-dimensional. In the flat morning light, the waviness of it suggesting compression forces that had built over decades inside a tree that had experienced specific significant stress during its growth. The driver looked at it before he climbed back onto the wagon. He stood for a moment, which was unusual. Ket had never done this, and his replacement before this young man had never done it either. He looked at the slab the way someone looks at something that surprises them. "That's a good one," he said, not to Willa specifically, just to the air. Then he got up and drove the wagon back up the track toward the Callaway Road. Willa set her coffee on the porch rail. She walked across the yard to where the slab lay. She crouched beside it, knees folding the way they had folded beside hundreds of slabs on hundreds of mornings, the movement so familiar it required no thought. She put her right hand flat on the face of the slab near the center, where the flame figure was most pronounced. She ran her hand along the grain slowly in the direction of the fibers, the direction you always move first, reading before cutting, understanding before acting. The surface was rough from the saw blade. Beneath the roughness was the character of the wood, the specific density of white oak that had grown under stress. The figure that stress had produced, the 60 or 70 years of specific weather encoded in the rings she could see in the end grain from where she crouched. She had learned over 5.5 years to read those things as information rather than aesthetics. The figure told her something about the tree's history. The density told her something about the region and the growing season. The width told her something about the specific position in the old-growth stand from which Cascade timber had taken it. All of this was present in the surface under her palm, readable if you had spent enough mornings learning to read it. She stayed crouched for a long moment. She was thinking about her grandfather, but not in the way she had thought about him in the early years. The specific retrieval of memory, the deliberate return to the carriage house workshop in Lexington, the effort of keeping his instruction available. She was thinking about him the way you think about a person who has become part of how you understand things, not someone you consciously remember, but someone who has become a component of the instrument you use to perceive. Ephraim Kalt had been dead for 15 years. What he had said to an 11-year-old in the summer of 1872 had taken 28 years to become necessary, then 5 more years to become understood, then another year beyond that to become the thing she operated from, rather than the thing she was trying to reach. The question he had posed, whether you could see past what something looked like right now to what it wanted to become, had seemed, when she first retrieved it, to be a question about perception, about visual acuity, about the trained eye that could look at a warped table on a trash day street and see furniture worth restoring. She had worked for 2 years under the assumption that this was what she was developing the trained eye. She understood now that the eye was only the beginning. What the question was actually about was the willingness to remain in relation to something long enough for its potential to become visible. The warp table was not a test of vision. It was a test of attention sustained past the point where most people's attention ran out. The slabs in her field had not revealed their quality in the first month or the first year. They had revealed it only to someone who was still looking in the 22nd month, the 26th month, who had maintained the relationship between observer and material past, every point where stopping would have been reasonable. Most people stopped, not because they were lacking something essential, because they had not learned or had not been shown that the moment just past the point where stopping seems reasonable is frequently the moment when the thing becomes clear. She stood up. Her knees registered the cold in the way they had started to register cold in the past year, a slight stiffness that took the first movements of the morning to work out. She was 44. Her hands had the permanent roughness of 5 years of workshop work, the same kind of permanent roughness she had noticed in Pearl's hands when Pearl had handed her the workshop key, the same kind she had seen in Silas's hands the first morning she had sat on the stool in his workshop and watched him work without speaking. She was not finished. The backlog was 5 months long. The price commission was in progress. The third person she had identified, a young man named Garrett, who had spent 3 years in a cabinet shop in Eugene before that shop closed, was starting the following Monday. The delivery slabs in the field numbered 34 in various stages of drying, the oldest of them approaching readiness. The newest beginning the long process of releasing the moisture that made them dangerous to cut. She was not at an ending. She understood this with the same clarity she brought to moisture assessment, to grain reading, to the compound angle of a chairback mortise. What she was at was a particular point in a longer process, the point where the work had accumulated enough to sustain itself, where the thing she had built was no longer dependent on any single piece going right, where the failure of one commission would not unravel everything behind it. This was not success as a destination. It was stability as a condition. It was the moment when the structure could bear the weight of what came next. Silas was inside. He had taken to arriving before her on Wednesday mornings, making the coffee, sitting with Pearl in the kitchen before the delivery came. She could see the lamp through the workshop window, the specific warm color of it, against the gray October morning. She could hear faintly the sound of Pearl's voice, the lower register of Silas's response. She looked back at the slab one more time. The flame figure ran from the wide end toward the narrow live edge densest near the center, dispersing toward the margins in patterns that had no symmetry but had a rightness, the kind of rightness that came from the conditions of growth rather than the decisions of a maker. She had not made this. The tree had made it over 60 years of specific weather in a specific place, and Cascade Timber had cut it down and rejected it. And Amos Gettrick had found her property on a map and knocked on her door in the spring of 1882 because he had a disposal problem, not a vision. That was how it had started. No design, no foresight, a logistics problem, and a debt and a widow who stayed because going was not a better option. The design had come afterward, accumulating through the space between what the situation was and what she chose to do inside it. Morning after morning, slab after slab failed joint after corrected joint until the choosing had compounded into a direction. Her grandfather had not been talking about wood. She had known this for a long time, but she understood now, crouching in the October air over a flame-figured slab of white oak, that nobody had wanted that he had also not been talking only about opportunity. He had been talking about the nature of attention itself, the way it transforms what it touches, not by changing the thing observed, but by changing the observer. The slab under her hand was exactly what it had always been. The 40 acres behind her were exactly what Thomas's father had homesteaded in the 1860s, rocky basalt underlaid, thin-soiled, not much good for cattle. Cascade Timber's reject pile was still a reject pile. She was not the same person who had stood on this porch in the spring of 1882, watching Ket unload the first delivery without knowing what she was looking at. She had become someone who knew how to look. Not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently to see the next piece, to make the next commission, to identify the next problem before it became the wrong kind of mistake. sufficiently to understand that the looking itself was the work, that skill was only the instrument through which sustained attention became material form. She picked up her coffee from the porch rail. It had gone cold, which happened most mornings. She set it down to look at the wood. The looking took longer than it seemed to. The coffee was always cold by the end. She had stopped minding this somewhere in the second year. She went inside. The workshop was warm. The coffee on Pearl's stove was fresh. Silas looked up from the corner stool when she came through the door, the same steady assessment he had offered from the first morning. She had appeared at his gate on Miner's Flat, the look of a man who had spent a lifetime reading materials and had extended the same practice without ceremony to people. She poured a cup. She set it on the corner of the bench where she always set it. She put on the apron. Outside, the October light was doing what it did in Oregon at that hour, flattening across the field, finding the white of the stickered slab's end grain, making the chalk notations legible from 20 yards. 34 slabs, some ready, some waiting, each one different from every other one in ways that only became clear over time. She picked up a chisel. The morning's work was already in her hands before she started the sequence of it, the specific problems in the Price Commission's library table that she had been turning over since the previous evening, the clamp placement on the chair assembly Calvin had set yesterday that she wanted to check before the glue advanced past the correction point. There was no ceremony to it. There had never been ceremony to it. Just the work morning after morning, the wood telling her what it needed from someone who had finally learned to listen with enough patience to hear it.